Good evening. Welcome or welcome back, as the case may be. My name is Alan Price. I am the director of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum, and on behalf of all of my library and foundation colleagues, many of whom are in the room or watching online with you, I'm glad to welcome you to this evening's program. And let's see, are we closing the door, or we leave it up? Fine. I'd like to acknowledge the generous underwriting support for the Kennedy Library Forum's lead sponsors, Bank of America, the Lowell Institute, and CVS Health, as well as the Mass Cultural Council and our media sponsor, the Boston Globe. To open, I humbly start with a land acknowledgement to recognize that the land on which we stand was once stewarded by Indigenous peoples. And while a land acknowledgement is not enough, it is an important way to promote Indigenous visibility, and it serves as a reminder that we are on stolen and settled Indigenous land, and I invite all of us to contemplate how to better support Indigenous communities and learn how to honor and take care of the land that each of us inhabits. I'd like to thank you in advance for silencing your cell phones. We look forward to a robust question and answer period this evening. You'll see full instructions on screen for submitting your questions via email or comments on our YouTube page during the program. And when the question and answer begins, we will invite those of you who are joining us in person to proceed to the microphones in the aisles to ask your questions. Anita McBride and Barbara Perry have kindly agreed to sign copies of their books after tonight's program, and our bookstore has copies available for sale if you are interested. We're so pleased to have this opportunity to reflect on the evolution of the role of the First Lady from the Kennedy administration through the present day with our distinguished guests this evening. I've been excited about hosting this conversation at the Kennedy Library since last fall when they were panelists at the White House Historical Association Conference in Washington, D.C. And so I'm so glad to welcome Anita McBride to the library this evening. She's director of the First Ladies Initiative at American University School of Public Affairs. Her experience includes service in 3 U.S. presidential administrations at the White House and Department of State, and as Chief of Staff to First Lady Laura Bush. She is the co-author of the new book, Remember the First Ladies, The Legacies of America's History-Making Women. It is also always delightful to welcome back Barbara Perry to the library. She is the Gerald L. Baliles Professor of Presidential Studies at the University of Virginia's Miller Center, where she co-directs the Presidential Oral History Program. She has authored or edited 17 books on presidents, first ladies, the Kennedy family, the Supreme Court, civil rights, and civil liberties. She is a great friend and champion of the Kennedy Library and Museum. It is also a pleasure to welcome Elizabeth Rees back to the library this evening. Forgive me. I really should do this with my reading glasses, but here we go. A doctoral candidate in history at Oxford University, her thesis project investigates the development of the East Wing staff and the Office of First Lady from 1961 to 1976. Her fellowships and honors include service as a White House Historical Association 2023 Next Gen Leader. Please join me in welcoming our special guests.
Thank you. Terrific. Here we go. Oh, this is great.
Well, thank you, Alan, so much for that wonderful introduction.
Yeah.
And for giving us a tour of one of the new exhibits here at the library. And I'm coming back tomorrow to see it, so if you haven't seen it, on World War II. And not only how the Kennedy family was related to that conflict, but also it is very diverse in telling us how almost all American families in some way were connected to that conflict. And we were shown down in the wonderful atrium here, photos flash up of family members of residents of the Boston area who sent these photographs of their family who served. And as a daughter of a World War II veteran, it really made me particularly happy. And Anita and I are talking about doing a children's book, maybe aimed at middle schoolers, called Poppy and Jack, about Bush 41, George H.W. Bush, and Jack Kennedy, and how both of them almost lost their lives in the South Pacific, but took heroic action, and thank goodness came home and became president. Well, with that, let me also say that it's just really such a pleasure to be here with friends and colleagues, Anita and Elizabeth. I've known Anita for probably a decade or so now, since she came down to Charlottesville and did an oral history with us on her time in the Bush 43 presidency, but also Bush 41, and her husband Tim as well did interviews with us. And I just never dreamed that we'd be serving on the White House Historical Association's Board of Directors, so that is always a pleasure. And then Elizabeth is my newest colleague
on the blog,
because we met at the Presidential Site Summit in Washington last September, and Anita and I had served on a panel, and when we ran into Alan after that, he also knew of Elizabeth and her interest in research in First Ladies, so he said, why don't you put a panel together and come up to the library? And I jumped at the chance, because it's been since the pandemic that I've been here, so as I said to everyone, it's like coming home for me. So let's think in terms of some of the great First Ladies we've had. I've just finished writing a chapter on public legacies and memorializations of First Ladies, and I decided to start, I couldn't do all the First Ladies, but I decided to start with Abigail Adams. But I thought I would turn first to Anita, because this book that she has done with our colleagues Nancy Keegan-Smith and Diana Carlin, who are all experts on First Ladies as scholars as well as practitioners. They cover all the First Ladies, and they cover themes as relate to First Ladies, including the theme that Elizabeth has been working on, which is how they staff their offices, how they develop their offices, and how that helped them to engage in the protocols as well as the policy areas and portfolios of First Ladies. So I would like Anita to start with a little bit of an overview of how we should think about First Ladies. And did you come away from doing this book, which I should point out was done as a textbook, and we were talking about this on the way over. It is rare, if ever, that a textbook becomes a trade book. It's so popular and so popular in its topic that it actually gets sold to the general public beyond students, who will also obviously benefit from it. So you had already worked with First Ladies and seen them up close and personal, but what did you gain, and what should we know about the whole arc of First Ladies before we start to dig into some individually?
Well, thank you, Barbara, for sort of setting up that umbrella, to be able to discuss this topic, because one of the things that I found so fascinating and really set us on this course of understanding how, from the very beginning of the founding of our country, our first president recognized that being president was a two-person job. And as head of state and head of government, he really needed someone to help with the head of state ceremonial duties. And lucky for him, Martha Washington was a very skilled hostess, and it was an important function in the founding of our new nation. And he valued her role and contribution. It wasn't called First Lady then, she was called Lady Washington or Mrs. Washington. But right from the beginning, valued her role and the contribution that she would make. And when she was welcomed to the shores of New Jersey, when President Washington, now had been president for 6 weeks, and greeted Martha Washington, who had just come up from Mount Vernon, greeted her with incredible fanfare to set the tone right away that this role, this position, this partner to him was important. And so we see that, throughout our history. I mean, some presidents, as times were changing for roles for women, where women didn't have a public voice and weren't on the public stage. Some husbands, like Calvin Coolidge, wanted Grace Coolidge to stay he was silent, wanted her to be silent too. But, again, as the country evolved, as women's roles evolved, and they gained a greater voice on the public stage and involved in the public square. It's so too has that been the role of first ladies, contributing more to policy and to our politics and to our global diplomacy. But our first 9 first families, I think, were slaveholders, so there was no staff. They relied on slaves, except for Abigail Adams, who was an abolitionist. And the first professional staff member didn't even come into being until 1901 with Edith Roosevelt. I'm sure you'll talk a lot about that. And that, obviously has evolved over time. It's now a fairly large staff for a first lady. Proportional to the work that they're doing.
Well, before we get to that in the 20th century, which will open up this topic really for the staffing of First Ladies' offices and the concept that there is an office for the First Lady, right. 2 of these First Ladies really stand out to me in addition to Abigail Adams, so feel free to jump in if you want to say anything about her. And we're so near to where she and John, of course, were from outside Boston. And one is Dolly Madison, and the other, as we get into the 20th century, is the second Mrs. Woodrow Wilson.
Sure.
Because they both played such keen roles in their husband's presidency. Elizabeth, do you want to jump in there?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think particularly the Wilson administration is very interesting because obviously President Wilson suffers from poor health, he has a stroke, and Edith effectively kind of really shields him, and she makes sure that people don't really know about this. And the kind of access and control that she has around, President Wilson is, pretty influential. You think about the power that these women have. They are the second closest person, So really she has this extraordinary access. And one of the other things that's particularly fascinating, I was finishing up some of my research and I got the chance to go to the Library of Congress, and I thought, well, I'm going to go, because I sort of work in the 60s with my project, but I thought I'll go further back and see what the precedent is for previous social secretaries. So I went and I looked at Edith Benham Helms' files, who was a long-time serving social secretary, and she has these extensive diaries that she had handwritten because she went along with the Wilsons to the Paris Peace Conference. And you just think about the access that even the staffers kind of had. And this hasn't really even been spoken about and acknowledged that much by historians. So that's sort of something that's particularly interesting. And she actually did write her own memoirs, so that's something that you could go and read if you want to learn more. And I think also with Dolly Madison and Abigail Adams, kind of thinking about women in this sort of early Republic period, this social hostess role is not one that is apolitical. Absolutely. Social diplomacy was a very real thing, and particularly I think of the work of the scholar Catherine Algor. Parlor Politics was the really influential book that she wrote. And these informal spaces, right, where politicking is happening outside of these closed government rooms that are full of men. And women are actually involved in this story. And first ladies are right at the heart of that. And I think that's something that's particularly interesting about those early women, where it's not clear that they're involved in policy and agenda, but actually it's happening behind the scenes.
And certainly President Madison valued Dolly Madison's political astuteness even more than he did her social graces, and she was an incredible unifier, bringing all sides together, knowing how to work the room and get valuable pieces of information that were so important for her husband. She was incredibly popular and remained, throughout her life, and really was a guide to so many first ladies that followed. She knew how to do the job. That's for sure.
She did. And you mentioned Catherine Algor, another of her books, A Perfect Union, about the marriage of Dolly and James Madison. And to think of those women, too, as Cokie Roberts' book called them our founding mothers, that they are there at the founding of the country and not only supporting their husbands, but also taking part in the discussions. And Abigail Adams, of course, part of her legacy is writing to John Adams
Absolutely.
in 1776 when he is helping to push forward the revolution and helping Jefferson to write the Declaration of Independence. And she knows that if we become a new country with a new constitution, she famously says, remember the ladies.
That's the title of our book, comes right from that. No, she was the eyes and ears of the revolution for him.
Absolutely was. And to be here in the midst of the war, and to be here in the midst of the Revolutionary War. And then with Dolly Madison, as you say, Anita, to really bring together the first that we have of partisanship. Washington wasn't highly partisan, wasn't really considered to be partisan. The founders worried about political parties, called them factions, and all factions were evil and bad as far as they were concerned. But what did they do when they walked out of the Philadelphia Convention in 1787, having produced our second Constitution, was divide into two political parties, one in favor of the new Constitution, one not. So by the time Dolly came to be First Lady, you had the Federalists and then the Jeffersonian Republicans, or Democratic Republicans as they were called, and they were just at each other hammer and tongs. And because she was so skilled in her social graces, and Washington was such a backwater, that she was able to bring people together in social settings to lead us to what we call the era of good feelings, which I think we would all pray for.
She did it for a long time. We have to remember she did it for President Jefferson too, fulfilled this role, and then for her own husband, and it's an extraordinary contribution.
And the fact that I always say about little Jemmy, as he was called, the short in stature James Madison, but the long on intellect, but also the short on charisma, apparently, whereas she was just oozing with charisma, and her clothing, her fashion, her headwear that would have big
she would be seen.
Yes.
She would be seen.
You could pick her out of the crowd. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the first to have an inaugural ball.
That's right.
So again, starting from that early period, again, coming up to the 20th century and the second Mrs. Woodrow Wilson, that now people are looking back, and I suppose they did it even at the time, to say she was our first woman president, because she did control access by the Congress to him, by the cabinet to him, after
the vice president.
The vice president to him. And there's a picture of him once he's able to get out of bed and dress, and he's signing some official document because his right hand, which was his primary hand, was not affected by the stroke. And she is using her hand to hold the document. So I say she's literally his left hand at that point. And Cokie Roberts' daughter, Rebecca
wrote a great
Roberts
book.
a wonderful book just in the last couple of years called Untold Power, about the power of Edith Bowling Galt Wilson.
I think we're being very nice. It was extraordinary overreach.
Well, I was just sort of hoping for a woman president,
Had to work with then the parameters.
Unelected.
But you're right. And by the way, this is one of the reasons that we have the 25th Amendment, so that if a president does become...
I guess we can thank her for
Yes,
that.
I say unwittingly, she forced us into having the 25th Amendment, but it's something good to have in case the president becomes incapacitated. We now have an official way to deal with it. And I should say it was Dwight Eisenhower, who had suffered a terrible heart attack in 1955, who had pushed his Attorney General, Herbert Brownell, to do something along these lines, but it took until the 1960s for that 25th Amendment to be ratified. But we'll thank Edith for that. But say she went a bit too far. So let us start with what oftentimes presidential scholars will say is the modern presidency. And some go back as far as Teddy Roosevelt, but most say Franklin Roosevelt. And so let's start with the first modern First Lady, and that would be, of course, Eleanor Roosevelt. I say she is sui generis. There is no other First Lady like her, and there's unlikely to be one like her in the sense that no First Lady, unless the 22nd Amendment is repealed, who will serve for 12 plus years. So I throw the name of Eleanor Roosevelt out to both of you. Let's have a chat.
Well, I think it's an interesting starting point with the Roosevelt administration, I think, is to step back, not from the first ladyship, and think about the presidency overall. Because this was a period where the presidential bureaucracy was sort of reorganized on a sort of broader spectrum, and the government expanded, right, with the New Deal. And I think fitting the story of the first ladyship into that is something that's an important thing to do to contextualize it. And I mean, Eleanor Roosevelt really was sort of a pretty extraordinary character, and has sort of since been seen as this feminist icon. But I think in some ways you can kind of trace a sort of history of women's benevolent work in terms of the kind of lineage that she was following in the footsteps of, right? But obviously a huge supporter of civil rights and very much had her sort of own agenda running kind of alongside Franklin, but often at times sort of being seen as being far too liberal, right? Which was something that caused him a few issues. And they were sort of pulling apart, actually, at some points. But I mean, one of the things that she is particularly, you know, a thing that is massive in terms, and I think can't be overstated actually, in terms of the development of the modern First Lady's office and her staff, is her relationship with the press, right? And many scholars have spoken about how this need to coordinate with the press actually drives the expansion of the First Lady's staff, because a huge part of that is press operations. And I think this is something that we can really see starting in the Roosevelt administration. And of course, Eleanor Roosevelt has her own newspaper column. She writes My Day, and she also hosts press conferences, radio, of course. She is on the radio, and I think she is the first voice that is heard after Pearl Harbor.
That's right.
Rather than the president, because that's
Sunday
the
night.
next day. But she also hosts news conferences for press women, because women of the press, it was sort of not a situation where we had women kind of reporting in the same way that we do now.
They had difficult
right?
access
they had
to the
no
president's press operation. They were excluded in some ways, and she completely grabbed hold of that. I think, to the point that Elizabeth is making, too, she had all these communication skills well before she came to the White House. This is a woman that was making money, writing speeches, writing articles, you know, coming into the White House, and she was worried that she would be constrained, and her husband did not want her to have quite the voice that she was used to. But she found a way to completely turn that position into a way that it worked for her. And with not very much staff. She had a social secretary. She had, you know, a friend that helped, Lorena Hickok, that really helped her with the access to the female press corps. But she really pushed up against the barriers that not only her husband, but her husband's advisors to try to put on her. And she was his arms and ears and legs, and, you know, eyes and ears and legs, excuse me. So it fulfilled an incredibly important role.
Yeah, and that's how that relationship with them had begun, right? When he contracted polio in 1921, and really had 3 years of trying to come back from that and hoping to have a political career, but also the difficulties of their marriage that had happened just before that she might have been willing to go ahead and have a divorce, but Sarah Dellen Roosevelt had other ideas.
Other Mrs. Roosevelt.
Yes, and forced them, in a sense, to stay together, but that she did not want to lose her independence coming into the White House. And Elizabeth, your point, too, about sometimes getting crosswise with Franklin was all about partisanship and what the Democratic Party represented at that time, which was a major figurehead in the South, that most of the senior officials in Congress were Democrats, about a third at least of the 2/3 majorities he had in the House and the Senate. So when she would push him towards civil rights, towards things like the anti-lynching bill, he would just say, I can't do that. I'll lose
the South.
I'll lose the South. So she kept on going in her own direction, but in essence, because she didn't have an official role, she didn't have to worry so much about that. And I often will say she never had her name on a ballot, so she didn't have to worry about finding a middle ground or finding compromise, but good for her. Did you want to say anything more about her working with the press and about Lorena Hickok? And then how do we get from her to Mrs. Kennedy, and her being the first to really not designate someone a press secretary as such, but in the social secretary realm as a press liaison?
I'll say one thing about that and then turn it over to you, Elizabeth. What I found really, so fascinating about Mrs. Kennedy, who really understood the power of image and of messaging, and was the first to hire an assistant for press relations under the office of the social secretary, not necessarily a press office, but her guidance to Pam Turner, I think her name was.
Pamela Turner.
Pamela Turner was give the media and the press as little as possible, but do it very nicely. Which I think, every press person can appreciate. I'm not sure we got Dara Donahue, who's here, was deputy press secretary to Laura Bush in the Bush White House. I'm not sure we ever told you to do it that way, but it is, interesting. Give as little as possible because they did not like the intrusiveness in their lives, which you can respect, particularly when you have young children.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I mean, Mrs. Kennedy and the press is a whole fascinating thing in and of itself. And I mean, a very difficult relationship with these women. But ironically, Mrs. Kennedy herself had worked in the press. She was the inquiring camera girl for the Washington Post when she was younger, before she married Jack Kennedy. And I actually found there was another one of my archival finds, fresh out of the archives, so you can see it's at the top of my mind.
It's exciting to find those things.
So exciting. But I was reading the files of Bess Furman, who is, again, a very well-known Washington journalist and social reporter. And Jackie Kennedy had written to Bess Furman saying, I so dream of being a journalist, and this seems like such a fascinating world. And so when she was younger, she was really fascinated by journalism and goes on to have this career. But then when she's in the White House, it's really, the relationship is very much trying to keep the press at arm's length. And actually, internally, Jackie and her staff did refer to the press ladies as harpies. They did not like them, to say the least. Particularly Helen Thomas and Frances Lewin of The Wire, Wire reporters who were there in the White House. And so it was this very kind of difficult relationship, but as you say, trying to drip feed them things and trying to do it in the nicest way possible so that they wouldn't come back at them for more. And I think, again, and I mean, this is many books have been sort of written on this, about Mrs. Kennedy and image and sort of curating image. And particularly, obviously, the main example of this is Camelot and how she is responsible for kind of constructing this with her interview after President Kennedy's death. But, this, I would say also, during the Kennedy administration, the press operations are sort of still kind of under West Wing control. Pierre Salinger is doing a lot of the reporting, and he actually gets sort of teased quite a lot for sort of reporting on Caroline's hamsters and ponies and things. So that's quite funny. But I would say really into the Johnson administration is where we kind of get a bit more separation, because we have Liz Carpenter, who is obviously appointed as press secretary.
A professional media person who knew exactly how to set up the operation. That was definitely an inflection point.
So let us start with that. Let us start with Lady Bird. And how did she know to hire a professional journalist to be her press secretary?
She was a communication specialist herself. I mean, this is a woman who was a millionaire. I mean, she owned radio stations throughout Texas. She knew the power of communication. She was a journalism student. That's how she graduated from UT Austin. With a degree in journalism. She would critique her husband's speeches and sometimes give them a B at best. You listen to these audio recordings and you think, Lyndon Johnson, who could talk to him like that? Well, his wife could talk to him that way.
Maybe the only person.
The one person who can.
That's right.
But that is, now that we were saying, the closest person to the president, one would hope, would be the spouse. And I call it pillow talk, but it might be that night after he comes back from a press conference or speech. But yes, in the case of Lady Bird, either he would call her or she would call him. Yes. And you mentioned the recordings. As soon as there was recording equipment available, Franklin Roosevelt began some recordings of meetings, but it really takes off with President Kennedy, and particularly Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon. And then you can understand why after Richard Nixon, presidents were a little bit skeptical about making voice recordings. But you can go to, I'm sure, the Lyndon Johnson Library, but also the Miller Center where I'm at the University of Virginia. We have a whole unit in the Miller Center that does nothing but focus on these tapes, and we've got historians that listen to them and people who work with them on it. They edit them, they annotate them, and so the one that I'm thinking about that I'm sure you're referring to as Lady Bird is saying, well, Lyndon, I thought your voice sounded a little breathy at points, and that's, I think, when she gave him the B overall. She gave him the B or the B+, and seemingly didn't have any backlash from him about it. How did it then grow? How did that help you say an inflection point? How did her hiring a professional press secretary, and then did she have any others that she hired and who she might have been the first lady to have a slightly expanded staff?
Well, she was very good at detailing staff from other departments and agencies. I mean, that really helped her in her beautification efforts, and she was really our first environmentalist first lady, and she really cared about our natural landscapes, our national parks, and so she detailed people from the Department of Interior. She detailed people from the Department of State who were protocol experts and all, dealt with diplomatic press relations as well. So she knew how to put her office together. She had a very skilled social secretary as well. I mean, the three of them planned the Lady Bird Express, the trip, through the South, which during the height of the civil rights legislation, deeply unpopular, and was deemed a trip that was too dangerous for the president to go on. So they sent the First Lady with a train that traveled 15 minutes ahead of hers in case there was a bomb on the tracks. I mean, real courage, incredible courage, extraordinary. I think, she really, I love her quote that she said, "I have a podium and I intend to use it." And I think that just says everything you need to know about Lady Bird Johnson. She just did not waste a moment.
Well, that makes me, first of all, anything to add, Elizabeth, about
one thing I would like to add, I think this point that Anita is making about the seconding staff from other departments and other agencies is really important, because then you get a specialization. You get women who have expertise. So, for example, Sharon Francis, who's sort of one of these women who is brought in from from Stuart Udall's office, from the Interior, and she is an expert on conservation. So these women have expertise, and they really are kind of driving up this sense of this is a professional staff and this is a real office and we are actually working on policy. And this actually had legislative output, right, with the Highway Beautification Act in 1965. So really, the women who are working in this office and the First Lady are directly involved in supporting 100%. Administration policy. The other thing that I would say about these women that I think is really important to remember is that, and I think maybe also sort of the Johnson administration could be seen as a bit of a turning point here too, is that these women are partisan. They're all Johnson ticket women, and they're all Democrats, Southern Democrats, right? And actually, interestingly, in the Kennedy administration, Letitia Baldridge had sort of been known to be a Republican. And, the Post writes of bipartisan spirit in entertaining at the Kennedy White House initially. And so it's quite interesting how, they really are sort of Johnson loyalists. And I think something that differentiates this kind of period, sort of 60s onwards, is that these are partisan women who are also heavily involved. Heavily involved in campaigning. Oh, she worked for Johnson when he was vice president, so she was very much Democrat through and through. And obviously, she went on to have a pretty illustrious career after campaigning for the Equal Rights Amendment. So I think the Johnson administration, a lot of work has been done on this, but the women in the Johnson administration, I think, you get the seeds kind of sown, I think, in the Kennedy administration of this professionalization of the East Wing staff kind of happening. But, the tragedy of the assassination, there is no second term. And I think really in the Johnson administration, we start to see this specialization, this expansion of the staff with these new women brought in, and also women's roles kind of changing more broadly in the 1960s.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And so that was something of the many things I learned in Anita's book was about the specialization and about the detailing from the government
Agencies.
bureaucracy and the agencies, which I'm sure in Eleanor
still
Roosevelt
happens.
Yes, and in Eleanor Roosevelt's case, we know that she worked with people across the government. I'm just thinking of expanding the Civilian Conservation Corps to include women, for example, and her connection with Harold Ickes at Interior. But it makes it more official, it seems to me, if rather than the First Lady going out to those people, having those people brought in, and as you say, it makes it seem more like a staff and more like an office, and maybe does make it more partisan, so be it. Let's also talk about, if we could, the projects and the policies part of it, that we know, going back to Martha Washington, that we have First Ladies who are involved in their husbands' administrations. But I think we tend to think of the more modern approach of picking up policy specialties to the point where we become used to that and we expect that from First Ladies, that when they come into office or even before their husbands might be elected, that they will say, well, if I should become First Lady, I will work on X. We know that, again, with Eleanor Roosevelt, that was a broad portfolio, which is why I say she's sui generis. But I think, but given that there was blowback against her and that you had Bess Truman come after her and then maybe Eisenhower, two very different kinds of women with different kinds of marriages, with different kinds of views of politics, so that Bess often stayed back in Independence, Missouri, and if you read Harry Truman's letters, he talks about how sad he is to be alone at the White House, and he says, I feel like something the cat dragged in because you're not here with me, Bess, the love of his life. And then with Mamie Eisenhower, who certainly knew how to support her husband through a 30-plus year military career, and knew how to entertain and had some pet projects, I would call them, not so much policies, but again, sort of reflecting the time of women post-war and in the 1950s. And if you're interested, by the way, in Mamie, her daughter granddaughter Susan Eisenhower has written a lovely book, memoir about her grandmother called Mrs. Ike. And she does, I think, give her props for the kinds of things she did, as well she should have. But I really do think it kind of takes off in the contemporary space with Mrs. Kennedy and the restoration of the White House, and creating that as a symbol, particularly, as I say in my book, during the Cold War, as a symbol of democracy, and with her young husband and her young children and the arts and historic preservation. But let's go to Lady Bird and then come forward. Talk about the policies that First Ladies, and maybe we can just begin, since we're sort of stepping off with the staffing of Lady Bird Johnson and her environmentalism and her Beautify America. I can so remember the ads for Keep America Beautiful and Don't Be a Litter Bug. And today I think of her when I drive in Virginia and the median is filled with daffodils.
Yeah, you thank her for
and
that.
that is Lady Bird Johnson. And I also am grateful if I'm driving in Florida and I don't see lots of awful billboards, or in Tennessee, see Rock City. I think some of those are coming back, but I am grateful to her for that, because she really did beautify the United States. So we do expect First Ladies now to have at least a project. And what does that mean for, when does that begin to really happen in earnest, and then that they need a staff for that?
Well, the staff started, growing after Mrs. Johnson. Of course, Mrs. Nixon, I will say, probably had the most difficult relationship in trying to expand her staff because of the pushback from the West Wing. The president's advisors really had very little respect for her and her contributions, even though she had done so much in all of Richard Nixon's campaigns, from when he ran for Senate, for vice president, for president. But when he came into the White House in 1968, brought a new team around him, the John Ehrlichmans, the Bob Haldeman's. They had no relationship with Mrs. Nixon, and they made it quite difficult for her. Mrs. Ford, when she came, was the first to hire a professional speechwriter, and she was doing a lot on the ERA. And then, of course, within 6 weeks of becoming First Lady, she goes public with a very private, tragedy of breast cancer, and she was very outspoken. She had a large correspondence staff. So did Mrs. Nixon. This is the one way she sort of controlled what she was able to do. Her correspondence letters that came into her, she responded to and responded to quickly. This was the one way she kept her connection with the American people.
And traveled around the
traveled,
world.
really the most traveled First Lady in our history next to Hillary Clinton. I think it might even be one more country above Mrs. Clinton. Extraordinary. The only First Lady to actually have the title of being personal representative of the president when she was traveling overseas. So President Nixon valued her. It's just that the structure around the White House made it very difficult for her to operate.
Well, I think Mrs. Nixon is particularly interesting as a character and has sort of been seen as a bit of a victim previously, which is happily being slightly rehabilitated. You know, there have been many good books on Mrs. Nixon recently and giving her fair dues, rightly so. And I think what's actually quite interesting is to think further back and to think about her time as second lady. And Barbara, earlier you mentioned Eisenhower's heart attack.
Yes.
And suddenly, you know, the Nixons are a heartbeat away from the presidency. And actually, because of sort of the strain in the Eisenhower administration, Pat Nixon did a huge amount of traveling as second lady.
She did.
And actually, she is really the first person to kind of elevate the role of second lady, to really be one which is sort of on the public stage and be one that's also recognized as being important and going out and greeting people and kind of taking up that role in a more professional way too. So I think that actually stands her in really great stead when she goes into the first ladyship. And there are a couple of women who have done that. Lady Bird Johnson is another one. Betty Ford for a very short period of time, you know. And so that's kind of an interesting factor. And you're right, Anita, in terms of correspondence, this was the one thing that she really really loved and cared about. And she would spend up to 4 hours a day working on her correspondence. And she thought that was so hugely important in terms of being in touch with the American people. But the other thing that was sort of her pet project that she championed was this idea of volunteerism. So sort of working with the elderly. And she also made visiting the White House more accessible. I think she introduced Braille and sort of sensory tours.
And
so
ramps.
And ramps, so that everyone could come and enjoy the White House, rightly so. So she really did a huge amount of really good stuff that I think we can all agree is good. But she had this, as you say, very difficult relationship with the staffers. And Gwendolyn King, who was the director of correspondence in her oral history interview, left some really interesting comments where she said, you know, I came into the office one day and Haldeman was sort of peering into everybody's desks and trying to read their papers. And I was told that I had to start reporting to them. And so the West Wing was, obviously the thing that had happened was they had realized how powerful the First Lady is on the world stage and how important a figure she is. And they were trying to just take control and really harness the operations in the East Wing for their own benefit and have a bit more control over what the image was and what was kind of going on.
Anybody from the West Wing step into the East Wing.
Exactly.
When we were there. I mean, that's
Well, we've got to get you to the West Wing. Before we do that, we know that Mrs. Carter is also an inflection
Game changer.
point, a real game changer, not only because who she was and what she did, but there's actually a law that gets signed about the office of, it turns out to have a section on the office of the First Lady. So
this is what I find most interesting about this, how Mrs. Carter was able to expand the staff and professionalize it now in another way, because there's a budget actually assigned to the Office of the First Lady, White House Personnel Authorization Act, 1978. But this, when you read her memoirs, you see, this is where she and her husband had their most arguments, where he campaigned on cutting the size of the White House staff, and she is wanting to expand it because of all the work she's engaged in. I mean, he hands her the Mental Health Commission to chair. She had to become honorary chair because you couldn't appoint your spouse as president to actually lead an initiative, so things had to be changed. But she's doing that. She's traveling like crazy around the world too, representing him. South America, she makes that great swing through 6 countries, and nobody believed that she would be successful there. And in fact, even the State Department briefers and the congressional briefers before she went just said that these are macho countries. They're not going to listen to you. And yet she opened up all these incredible doors for our diplomats that were serving there that really could not get the access, because these were countries where there was a lot of anti-Americanism. There were leaders being elected that were anti-American. So her visits down there really
into the Far East
things,
as
into the
well,
Far East as
about
well. She was,
immigration,
and then of course what
refugees.
she does sitting in the Camp David Peace Accords. I mean, there's over 200 pages of extemporaneous notes that she took on all of those deliberations that were going on there at Camp David. I mean, real-time human expression of just sort of the tension and the problems and the relationships
Being welcomed by her husband into the cabinet meetings, not participating.
She would go with her briefcase once a week to have lunch with him with all her papers of the things she wanted to go over
She
with
said,
him.
if I'm out and about talking about what's happening in my
Incredible
husband's
First Lady.
administration, I want to be able to speak with information
Right.
and knowledge.
And the first lady to have her own office in the East Wing.
She moves it to the
Yeah.
East Wing. That's
So
exactly right.
previously, they had sort of
Been
had
in their
this
dressing room.
casual, work from home
the residence,
situation,
yes.
but a very nice
Residence.
work from home situation.
Yes.
So, which again is one of these things where there's that sort of, it's interesting to think about the White House as a space, right? And to think about how, we have this idea of the sort of public-private kind of boundary, and that really doesn't exist, even though the residence is ostensibly a private space. And
You work over the store.
yeah, exactly, over the shop. And so sort of doing that work from home and then separating that from there is another one of these steps which is seen by historians as being a really important moment. And then obviously is taken a step further when Mrs. Clinton moved her office over to the West Wing, which is...
But still has her East Wing office.
Still has an East Wing office.
And the old executive office building.
Yeah.
She had an office there
Not
for
that
the Women's
Anita's
Initiative.
counting.
And Jackson Place, where she had the Millennium Council. It was incredible.
But real estate is power, right?
Yes,
In
it
Washington,
is.
And especially
Yes,
in
absolutely.
that White House grounds and the White House itself.
Exactly,
How many of you
Barbara.
have been on the tour of the White House or worked in the White House?
Oh my gosh, look at it.
Great. So you know that it is a rather intimate space.
It
And I
is.
think
It's
among the first
intended
things
to be.
people are taken with if they come in from the North Portico and that opening, that big opening, but it's not that big. And the staterooms are not that big. And the Oval Office, if you've been to the Oval Office, it doesn't look as big as it does on TV and in movies or in the
That's
West
true.
Wing show. Well, we don't want to skip over Mrs. Reagan, but we don't have to go completely in chronological order, and we can certainly swing back to her or include her. But I want to get Anita to the Bushes because Anita is so close with the Bush family, the H.W. Bush family and the W. Bush family, and so maybe speak a little bit about Barbara Bush as the second lady for 8 years before she becomes the first lady.
She was another extraordinarily active second lady. I mean, she spent her entire, 8 years. In fact, in her memoir, she has these incredible statistics of the thousands of events that she hosted for literacy and the number of dinners and the number of lunches, the number of overnight guests. She did not waste a moment of those 8 years. And she contemplated what she was going to do in 1980 when her husband ran for president, lost the nomination, of course, to Ronald Reagan. Barbara Bush was jogging around Memorial Park in Houston thinking, what project will I work on if I become First Lady? And she had determined literacy was her project, and she felt that was at the root of so many other problems in our country. And when she became First Lady, she launched the Barbara Bush Foundation for Family Literacy within 2 months of becoming First Lady. That foundation still exists. It's in its 34th year. Now, raised hundreds of millions of dollars, operates projects in all 50 states. So it's a real legacy, the way the White House Historical
I was just gonna say,
Association
of Mrs.
is
Kennedy.
for Jackie, the way Vital Voices is for Hillary Clinton. But what was interesting when she became First Lady, she gathered her staff early. on up in the residence and gave them a simple directive. I want to do something that helps people every single day, that helps someone every single day. That was her charge to her staff. And actually, each chapter of our book, we have a quote from a First Lady. And on the chapter about staffing the White House, the quote from Barbara Bush was, "It takes a good staff to run a good First Lady's office," and I had a very good staff. So that, and in her 4 years, she left some indelible marks, I think, on our country for
Well, and talk
her
about someone who had been
contributions.
so supportive of her husband.
Oh,
who
my
had
gosh, his
a
entire
golden
career.
resume, not only from his business oil work
Right.
in Texas, but then
Political,
in
diplomat.
had diplomat, our envoy to China, a member of
Right.
Congress, the head of the RNC during Watergate,
Right.
the UN ambassador of the United States. And then vice president for 8
Sure.
years. So she had a lot of experience at not only supporting, but knowing what a political wife had to do. And by the way, raising a family of five children.
Five children.
And losing.
Raising a lot of money.
And raising a lot of money, but also losing poor little Robin.
Right.
To leukemia and just such a hard time at the beginning of their early marriage. So, anything else about Barbara Bush that we want to say before moving along?
Did you discover anything in your research?
I have not got that far yet. The thesis project is very niche.
Yes.
We'll wait for the book in a few years.
Get Anita's book, and I've learned everything I know about staffs, first from talking in Washington to Elizabeth, and then reading the chapter on it. And here I am doing oral history, mostly of presidents.
Yeah.
We typically
Yeah,
don't get to interview
exactly.
First Ladies, but I would love to be able to do that. And now I'll know where to go before
Can I
do
say
that.
one thing about Nancy Reagan, though, that I'm very
Sure.
grateful? So she was
Sure.
the first to have a chief of staff. Because before Mrs. Carter had a policy director, staff director, but Mrs. Reagan actually named a chief of staff, elevated. This is someone who the West Wing never tell Mrs. Reagan what to do. She would tell you what to do. But it was a commissioned officer position, which in the hierarchy of the White House, that really matters. And so she didn't want her chief of staff to be chief of staff without that honorific title, and was a deputy assistant to the president, which is the second highest rank. And it remained that way for many years until the Clinton administration was elevated to assistant to the president. I'm very grateful I was that too. But
And
I think
I
Mrs.
learned
and
that.
her chiefs of staff were all men.
Yes.
She had
Yeah.
not one woman be a
Yes.
chief of staff.
And it's very much a feminine enclave
Yes.
up until this point,
Yes.
when you have a number of male chief of staffs under Nancy Reagan. And then in particularly Michelle Obama's administration, there are far more men working on the staff by this point.
And
we
a
have the
social
first
secretary that's a
male
man.
social secretary, yes.
First one.
Yeah, and so the staff is very much reflecting contemporary
Yes.
gender norms,
Exactly.
or just being more representative of society, right? Very much in many ways, like the First Ladyship, are just a mirror to sort of where society is at.
Yes, exactly.
And that's kind of another interesting thing when we think about Mrs. Trump as well, right? The first naturalized US citizen to be First Lady, but not the first non-native,
Right.
which is
John Quincy, Mrs.
yes,
John Quincy Adams.
Yes, exactly.
I'll take First Ladies for 10.
Yeah.
We're going to say a few words about another sui generis First Lady, Hillary Clinton, but I hope you're thinking of your questions or your comments and getting ready to come to the microphone, so we're going to leave plenty of time for that. So after we have the Bushes, the Clintons come to the White House, and also a different marriage, the first baby boom First Lady and First President as a baby boomer. Hillary Clinton with her own career outside and a professional. She had met her husband at the Yale Law School. And so she has been the breadwinner in that family. He's been in Arkansas politics and the governor of Arkansas, but don't make a lot of money, or at least at that time did not. So she's, as the Rose Law Firm, a partner, has made the money for the family, and they have a young daughter that they're raising. But remember what Bill Clinton said during the campaign, famously or infamously, I guess, depending on one's view, that if you vote for me, you'll get a twofer, because Hillary will be basically my partner in policy. So explain how she did that and what the response was.
It wasn't easy. The country was just not ready for it. And there's no question she was skilled. I mean, completely, knowledgeable, smart. As you say, as a lawyer, been deeply involved in issues and child welfare issues, healthcare issues. She was, of course, perfectly suited to do the things that the president wanted her to do. Let's remember, he handed this health commission, healthcare reform commission, to do it, to run it. He trusted her, she could do it. Again, the country just was not ready, as you say. It was a generational change. Some of the issues, too, was not done in a very transparent way, which is really what hurt the initiative. And when it ultimately, failed, I mean, she really took a step back, completely retooled. The pivot was now towards the international work, and global women's empowerment made that very famous speech.
Did very well
very
at that
well.
with her speech in
Beijing. It's considered one of the top 100 rhetorical speeches of the 20th century. Interestingly enough, 4 first ladies. We write about that in the book, 2 from Eleanor Roosevelt, Hillary Clinton's Beijing, and the one that surprises everybody is Barbara Bush's speech to Wellesley. Where there was such backlash, against her speaking to the students. They protested against it. She went up to the stage to speak, not knowing that it was being carried live. I mean, it was, but completely turned around the
She was thought to be too
situation.
conservative and non-feminist
and thought to
enough,
be, and not have, and achieved her status only through her husband and not through anything, completely dismissing, decades of work and service that she gave to the country. It was just a very complicated relationship with the feminist movement.
Yes, and what was her famous line? Do you remember? That
The one at the end that brought the house down. Do you
Yes.
want to say it, or you want me to say it? Okay.
you're friends with me, with my namesake.
Yeah. At the end of her speech, she basically looks to the audience and says,
All women.
somewhere out
Wellesley,
there,
all women.
right? Well, and somewhere out there, who knows, maybe one of you will walk in my shoes someday, and I wish him well. Which was brilliant.
And you can see it if you don't want.
Yes, you can YouTube it.
Watch the whole speech.
It's great.
Because she talks about having careers,
Yeah.
being homemakers, but always keep your personal relations going.
Right.
And then with that great line, so if you just want to see that part,
Oh,
but
it's
it
worth
just
it.
brings the house, it's actually outside, but they're in a tent, as I recall, and
That's
there's
right.
just roars of
Oh,
approval from the students.
absolutely.
It is just amazing.
And incidentally, can I just say, she called the student that left the protest, that led the protest when this all happened, spoke to her almost an hour on the phone in the girls' dorm. There were no cell phones back then, right? This was a phone in the hallway of the dorm, and just said, I understand where you're coming from and how you're feeling, but I want to tell you a little bit about my life too, and the choices I
the
made.
college named an award to this day, the Barbara Bush Award for Volunteerism.
Talk about turning
give
things
to a
around,
student.
right?
Yeah, another part of her legacy. Questions? Anybody want to come to the microphone and ask a question? If you're not able to come to the microphone, wave
could
at us
probably hear you.
madly and speak loudly, and I'll repeat the question. Yeah, are you able to come to the microphone, sir? Just over here on the steps, that'd be great.
Great. Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize.
Just so the people at home could hear.
Yes.
I had a question. I had a question about the future of
about that.
First Ladies, and I don't know if your book is aptly titled or not, given what will probably happen.
It will
at some
happen,
point.
but we don't want to forget the women who
That's
served in
That's
history.
true.
And it will happen.
And I do have a question as well. So we have that.
And
Okay.
let me ask you, what would you like the title of the first, let's say, non-binary or non...
That was exactly the question I was going to ask.
Oh!
Both,
Great minds.
Both, exactly. Both, what will happen when we have a man, to Barbara Bush's point, a man who is a first lady, but also what will happen when the person says, I want to be identified as non-binary. What will we call that person?
I think I think we'll see,
I
and
have
we will.
no idea what I would call the book. That's such a good question. I'll let
It will
you
still be a
three
presidential
decide.
spouse. It will
Yes.
still be a presidential spouse. So regardless,
I would suggest
yes.
first person for the non-binary person.
Yes.
And how about for the
Right.
first gentleman?
Well, and that we came close to that a couple of times, right? We contemplated it in 2008. We contemplated it in 2016. We have many examples of it in our country where the chief executive of state is a woman, and that their spouses or husbands serve. We're calling it a second gentleman now for the vice president's husband, who, incidentally, if you ask him, what's your primary role, he'll say, to support the vice president. It's a very traditional response. And he's been given, though, an initiative by the administration leading the anti-Semitism initiative. So you're already seeing, the morphing and the potential of the role of First Lady, if it is a first gentleman.
And maybe because we have the first lady to continue her professional
Absolutely.
career while being first lady and
That's a
continuing
big
to
step.
do a lot.
Yeah.
I want to
Huge
ask Elizabeth, who represents another generation.
Yeah.
Oh, well,
What do you think?
Well, I mean, I think very much that Doug Emhoff will have kind of set an example, and I think that largely it will probably follow on from that. I'm not sure whether the role will actually change too much, because in terms of the policy that these figures are working on, they're sort of broadly good initiatives that everyone can kind of get behind. And it's not necessarily, I mean, there could be an argument that a lot of these things have previously been very gendered. I think that health and working with kids is something that's kind of been seen in the past as being very much a woman's sphere of influence. But I think if we're thinking in terms of sort of literacy, environmentalism,
crosses
mental
gender,
health, right?
gender
These
lines.
are completely cross gender and age distinctions. So I really do think that in terms of the policy and actually like the substance of the work of what the spouse does, I don't think it's really going to change
agree
too
with
much.
that 100%.
I think what might be interesting is what they do with this custom of displaying gowns at the Smithsonian after the inaugural.
Well, there'll be a suit.
There'll be a suit, which will be nice because we can have some menswear on display too.
Beautiful case for suits. Some men's
yeah.
designers should get their due.
Exactly.
I agree.
Very important, because we were talking about Mrs. Rose Kennedy's wear down in the World War II exhibit, where there's a photo of her and her husband, Ambassador Joseph Kennedy Sr., to the UK, and they had hosted then King George VI, along with Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. And I said, and when Rose went to be presented with her two daughters at Buckingham Palace, not long after they arrived in London, that she had her special dress that she had a designer make, and that she was so proud that she wore that for the inauguration of her son. Those
so many
20-some odd
kids.
years, and she'd had 9 children,
How
so she
did
made it
that-
a point to say, I don't think she needed it altered. And I'm hoping to see that if we still have it somewhere and see it on exhibit here. Yes, please, your question.
Hi, so I am here as a representative for your online attendees. So
Oh,
I actually
great.
have 2 questions for you.
Perfect.
Who would you say is the most overlooked or underrated First Lady? And what First Lady had the biggest impact on the presidency during her time in the White House?
Do you want me to go first?
Oh, goodness. Well,
I think
I feel like actually at time in the White House is kind of where I would get tripped up on this, because I think thereafter it would be Mrs. Kennedy in terms of the way that she shapes the Kennedy legacy and the way that the administration of her husband is remembered. And I think that can't be overstated enough in terms of how that is really something that she curates. So, but also, I mean, her time in the White House is something, her legacy in terms of the White House Historical Association and, the restoration, she didn't want it to be called a redecoration,
Right.
it was the restoration of the White House, I think is something which was just enormous. And Barbara, as you mentioned, the kind of cultural diplomacy that she was doing, when she went to France and went for dinner at Versailles with de Gaulle, and the Parisians were just sort of enthralled and completely taken with her. And so I think on the global stage, at that kind of point, if you think about what the impact of that was during the Cold War, I think that is massive. So I think she's probably one I would put up there. But honestly, it's very difficult to distinguish because they all kind of have their own rich legacies in these different ways, and they all play a huge part in their husbands' administrations.
And
Really.
I think one of the overlooked ones is Pat Nixon.
Yeah, I would agree with that
And
completely.
I think to Elizabeth's point, there are some good books that are coming out. There's a new one that's going to be coming out this summer that I think will help shine a light on just how much of a contribution
the Mary
that she
Brennan
made.
book previously, Embattled First Lady Pat Nixon. You should all go and read it because, yeah, I completely agree with that. And I think, you know, not only is her image kind of being slightly rehabilitated, but I think that in itself and these books coming out, you know, you mentioned the Edith Wilson book, also kind of points to a drive and like a thirst from the public to just know more about these women in general. Like lots of these women are really overlooked. And particularly in sort of before this modern period, I'm not anywhere near an expert on those years, but there are many women that kind of get left by the wayside, or you know, other women that kind of get left out are the sort of surrogate hostess
Oh
figures.
yes, we did not include them in
yes.
the book. That's a whole
Not,
other book.
not included, but a whole
Which,
other
yes,
book.
it's a
So
whole
Surrogate
other
first
book,
ladies.
right.
yes,
For
because
the-
they've all played a role, right? But
They
they should have their own book.
They did. Exactly. That's right.
Number 2,
An idea.
Anita.
And we haven't had a chance to mention Laura, so we want to come back to Laura Bush
sure,
as well.
sure.
Yes.
Good evening. My name is James Coughlin.
Hi, James.
Happy to be the nephew of Mary Burley Gallagher, who
Oh,
you may know the name.
Mrs. Kennedy's personal
She was
secretary.
Jacqueline Kennedy, secretary in the White House.
Yes. Oh.
And she was one of the first 4 hires that Senator Kennedy had upon becoming United States Senator from Massachusetts in 1953. And not known, perhaps, is that Jacqueline Kennedy established a nursery in the White
Yes,
House
that's right.
on the 3rd floor of the solarium for Jacqueline Kennedy and all the staffs of the White House to have their children be schooled in the White House.
Yes.
Yes,
And my
and it was
cousin's
even
Chris
more
Reagan.
than a nursery.
Sorry?
It was an actual school.
It was a preschool and then a kindergarten when
Right.
when
Correct.
Caroline
For
came to
Caroline.
that. Yes,
Yeah,
and it
Mother-
was integrated, racially integrated with Andrew Hatcher's son because they were particularly the social secretary Tish Baldrige was getting a lot of questions. You can imagine in the early '60s questions from the public about school integration just coming after Brown v. Board, and so for certain it was. And I was just reading this again, that
Yes.
Mrs. Kennedy so wanted to preserve their privacy once again that she thought if she sent Caroline out to preschool or to kindergarten that she would be hounded by the press, and that also wouldn't be fair to her fellow classmates. So you have a question?
And among those in the nursery with my cousins in Virginia, Greg and Chris Gallagher, who are now living in Alexandria, Virginia. My aunt passed away last year, age of 98.
I saw that. Yes. and
Thank
she-
you.
What great memories they
Yes.
must have of
We'd
love
being
to speak with
schooled
you.
in the White
Before
House.
the Jacqueline Kennedy era of the White House, before she renovated the White House with my aunt's assistance, my aunt gave us a tour of the White House. I made a note here. She helped Jackie with all of the restorations of the White House in the Kennedy administration. My aunt gave us a tour of the White House from bottom to top, and she had excellent recall of every room that was renovated. The Madison room, the Roosevelt room, the Treaty room. Without any notes at all, she had excellent recalls of what each room signified.
And she also your aunt wrote a very lovely memoir of her time with Jacqueline Kennedy. And I have to tell you, I bought the book at B. Dalton's, I'm sure when I was in junior high or high school, for my own personal Kennedy library. And
Well, thank you.
It became one of my mother's favorites, and I still have it, but I have to hold it together with a rubber band because it was paperback, and Mother read it and reread it so often that the binding actually broke off of it. But she just, of course, my mother had taken me and my brothers to see Senator John Kennedy in 1960 in Louisville, Kentucky. And so we felt like we had a personal connection with him, and therefore Mother felt like she had a personal connection with Mrs. Kennedy. So she would read all the books I would bring home, and then she would talk to me about her as if through your aunt.
Yes.
She knew her.
Correct.
So we thank your aunt for leaving
You're most
that
welcome.
record.
She's very grateful for her service to the country.
Yes.
One thing about her was that my cousin Chris asked her mom to my Aunt Mary, you were the most powerful people in the world, JBK and JFK. She didn't think of it as an ordinary, she thought of it as an ordinary job, not anything spectacular at all.
No, but she was serving her country, and she
was.
sadly, she was in Dallas, as I recall, on that fateful day. So thank you so much for speaking
you.
up. I think we might have some others behind
My question
you.
is,
Oh, sorry.
before the Jackie Kennedy era in the White House of the Restoration, how did the White House appear before the renovations that Jackie did in '62?
Well,
Anita would know
That's my
that.
question.
we do have a whole chapter on
Thank
this
you.
in the book that
good.
we thought that is really tracing the evolution of all of the restorations, renovations to the White House. Because remember, of course, it was burned by the British in 1814, so had to be rebuilt. A major renovation in 1901 with the Teddy Roosevelt administration. Of course, they came in, they had 5 children. At that point, still the president's office is the same place where the first family lived. And
they
Mrs.
add the West
Roosevelt,
Wing,
they add
right, with the
add the West Wing, ultimately then an Oval Office.
And the East Wing's not added until
the East Wing's
Roosevelt
until
era,
45.
as a bomb shelter, a temporary bomb shelter, and then becomes
Right.
office space.
So there's, and then the biggest renovation, of course, a total reconstruction of the White House was in 1948 to 1952, 3.5 years when the Trumans were living there, where the building was deemed structurally unsound. It was falling apart from the inside out.
The piano was, the
And
leg was
falling through
breaking
the
through
ceilings.
the
and it
floor.
was just, everything needed to be
So
done.
down to the walls.
Down to the walls, and actually the exterior was preserved and then dug deep underneath, steel girded completely, renovated. And actually quiet Bess Truman, who had to follow Eleanor Roosevelt and famously said, "I'm not going down in any coal mines." She wasn't going to be very public. But her experience of having worked as a Senate staffer to her husband when he was a senator from Missouri, she knew how things worked. Frankly, I would consider her an early lobbyist, because when the proposals were given to the Congress to what it would cost to reconstruct the White House, there were several proposals. The cheapest was, of course, tearing the whole building down and starting over. And the most expensive was the one that ultimately was done. And a lot to do to Bess Truman, who really worked behind the scenes with Senate appropriators and the spouses of those who'd be making the Senate appropriation decisions. And basically her message was, if you do this, the American people will never forgive you, tearing down the building. So we have her to
And
really
thank goodness,
thank.
the icon that it is
Can you
to this
imagine
day
not
of
having
democracy
that?
and our country. And we don't have dueling books,
Yeah.
but I'll say in my chapter,
Yes.
Restoration of the White House, I was, like so many, I talked to Betty Monkman at
Right,
the time in the early
curator.
2000s, who was the curator, about Mrs. Kennedy's restoration
Mm-hmm.
of the White House. And she said, people are so locked in to what Mrs. Kennedy did and the tour of the White House that she gave. And by the way, President Truman had given a televised
he
tour
did.
with, I think,
When it was
Walter
completed.
Cronkite, when
That's
it was
exactly
completed.
right.
But people so remembered Mrs. Kennedy that Betty Monkman
extraordinary.
said in the early 2000s, they thought nothing had changed at the White House since the Kennedys left in 1963. And of course, it's always, thank goodness, it's updated, but also has to be constantly restored, which
Always,
is what we
with the
do
Historical
now
Association.
at the White House.
Well, I think there is no government money. If I can just say one thing, and this is the brilliance. Is this what you were going to say? This is the brilliance.
I was just going to point out the sheer wear and tear that the
Oh,
building kind of goes through, which
absolutely.
is sort of a minor point, but is one of the key reasons why we need all of
Yes,
this.
the funding.
Yeah, the funding.
Support. You know, Mrs. Kennedy in creating the White House Historical Association, this brilliant decision. This 31-year-old woman comes in to be First Lady and knows there will never, ever be enough government money to ever maintain, protect the White House as it should be. As a museum, as a place of excellence from top to bottom. And that's why the White House Historical Association really is the partner to the White House in all of the restoration, the acquisitions,
guidebook.
the collection, the guidebook that she established, that, you know, every visitor that came through there would pay $1 to get this wonderful guidebook. It's now in its 24th or 25th edition.
26, I think we're up to, yeah.
But brilliant stroke on her
And
part.
also, you can watch that on YouTube. You can watch her
Yes, her
tour.
walk
and
and
at the
talk.
very end, President Kennedy makes a cameo appearance where he talks about the Cold War, sort of in a veiled way, but that he says thousands of people come to this building.
Right.
Boys and girls learn about the presidency, learn about civics, and about we're not the oldest country in the world, but we're the oldest democracy in the world with a presidency, and that it's such a symbol and an icon.
And he didn't want her to take on this initiative.
That is right. That
He
is
thought it
right.
was elitist.
So I give him credit.
Yeah.
Thank you again,
Yeah,
sir.
thank you.
We have a few more minutes left. We have some more questions, please.
Yes, I have a couple more questions from our online viewers.
Okay.
Is there a first lady who made big mistakes? And the second is, how will history judge Melania Trump?
So in the mistakes category, as much as we love and we revere Abigail Adams, and we should, as a founding mother, sacrificed a lot for our country, she did make a decision that was not helpful to her husband, and really she did not like her husband being criticized in the press. And she was a big supporter of the Alien and Sedition Acts, that people could be, arrested and imprisoned for criticizing the president. That, was not, again, for someone who was so conscious about what the ideals of democracy and freedom were in our Constitution, and was an abolitionist because she believed, how could a country founded on freedom hold people in human bondage? I mean, she certainly had all of the right instincts about what it meant to be a democracy. But in this case, she really advised her husband poorly to sign those.
I'd like to tie these kind of two questions together and pick up the jacket, because
Yes,
whilst
that was a mistake.
that was a mistake, I just don't care.
Yeah.
Do you?
Ask me if I care.
Yeah,
I don't care, do you?
Yeah, which I think might have been from Zara or some, unfortunately. But yes, Melania Trump wearing that to visit the border whilst this immigration crisis was going on and children were being separated from their parents was just really not good. That was a mistake.
I think you never really want to see the words "I don't care" and "First Lady" in the same sentence. Not a good choice of wardrobe of someone who dressed beautifully every single day.
And particularly someone who has kind of been like apathetic almost to the role, right? She didn't appoint a staff until February, when they would usually be appointed during the transition. She didn't even move to the White House until June, which was largely to do with her son being schooled in New York. But I think, her legacy is particularly interesting in terms of, and I was kind of thinking about this when we were discussing Hillary Clinton earlier, in terms of what the boundaries of the role are, right? But also remembering that there is no kind of like constitutional description. There's no position description. She's kind of within her right to retreat and do that. But the power of this sort of the custom of these pet projects that first ladies have, is really kind of ingrained in American culture.
It's an expectation.
And it's such an expectation that it was so frowned upon that she really decided to step back. But I think it just goes to show how the role really is yours to define, and it's completely what you want it to be. So she's particularly interesting.
I think on the one thing of not coming until June of 2017, my view on that is, again, to your point, you get to pick and choose how you want to deploy your influence or not as First Lady, because A, you're not paid, and I don't think the position should ever be paid, because once that happens, then really you are obligated. But by not coming till later, I think she made it easier for anybody that succeeds her that might want to do the same thing, whether it's for children reasons or something
careers.
else. So I think you have to look at it in that somebody has to break the mold, and somebody has to establish precedent on whatever the issue might be. And that's in one case where she did that. Not choosing a staff until February is an interesting one to highlight, because what happened then was she lost positions that were allocated up to that point for the First Lady's office, now were gobbled up by everybody else, particularly in the West Wing. So now she comes in to hire a staff, and she's lost some budget and lost some positions. It's hard to crawl back and get that.
Yes, another question.
Hi, I am a former history teacher turned vice principal at an all-girls high school.
Great.
And we're currently celebrating International Women's Month. And, you know, we have a lot of buzz around the building, but I've noticed I hear a lot less about the role of first ladies. And I think a lot about how our girls have access to so much information and they consume media in different ways than perhaps we did growing up. I don't know if they would delve right into one of your books. So I'm wondering if you have any podcasts or social media resources that you think would be particularly engaging to that age group.
Sure. Well, first of all, through the White House Historical Association, where we have educational materials for all ages, from the little ones to, you know, all of us here in this room. We have a lot of online programs. We have some really good new initiatives and things that will be coming up. I'd love to give you that website. Use it as a resource. And also what we have teacher training institutes where we are training teachers of middle school and high school, history teachers, social studies teachers, with a lot of interesting and interactive materials that I think would be interesting to your students. To the point Barbara had mentioned that, you know, prior to this book there was a textbook. Now granted it's college level textbook, undergraduate level textbook, but what was the most interesting thing was as the students were assigned, you know, chapters to read, we were testing out this book before we actually rolled it out in August. To a fault, every single student, male and female, said, why did I never learn this before? So we are really, you know, we're missing an opportunity to teach students about these remarkable, you know, women in our history. Granted, it's got to be attractive to them. There is a recent podcast that's out now on First Lady. It's going to be a short, limited series.
Those
that actually
1600 sessions are really
in the
great.
1600 sessions.
There may be a bit more detail
best.
in them, but they're great and they're so easy to
The White
listen
House
to.
Historical
From the White House
Association
Historical
ones.
Association, and I think Anita's absolutely right in terms of the resources that
Access
you've got
them.
there are that is probably the best place to start for someone, right?
Yeah, I would agree. Thank you
And
for
we
saying
have to
that.
mention our buttons.
Oh, I know. So we're each a member, the three of us,
And Anita is a founding member.
member of an organization called FLAIR, First Ladies Association for Research and Education, and our mantra is lighting the lamp of their legacies, something like
Let's
that.
say
It's
the
It's got a flame. I'm sorry. All of our FLAIR members are watching are going to be so mad. How could the founding member not remember what they
Here at the library for Jacqueline Kennedy, we say the torch has been passed.
The torch has been passed, okay. But it's a wonderful organization. So our goal is there's so much scholarship and knowledge and interest on First Ladies, and we are really trying to collaborate nationwide and shine a light on all of their contributions.
So we have our own website. There's also a First
program.
Ladies Library in
Yep.
Ohio. They have their own website. And
have
I will
great.
also mention that there are, from Mrs. McKinley onward, slim books on First Ladies, mostly their First Ladyship, but what they did before and after by the University Press of Kansas.
Kansas, yeah, great books.
And so if students
Easy
have,
reads,
have
easy
an
reads.
have an interest in a particular First Lady, we highly recommend those too.
I would
And thank you
also
for teaching.
add on, maybe very briefly, if they were old enough, like there have been so many TV shows made recently, which I think again really shows how there is this public appetite for learning more about these women. I think the most recent one, which was sort of called First Ladies, which had Eleanor Roosevelt, Michelle Obama, and
Betty Ford. And
Yes.
CNN in 2020 did 6 sessions.
They did.
Six
Very good.
episodes on different First Ladies, which is, I think, very, it's for a broad audience, including young students and appropriate, age appropriate.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
Thank you for asking.
And for teaching.
Do we have time for just one more question?
Yes, this is the last one from our online audience.
Okay.
Did Mrs. Kennedy's devotion to privacy provide a structure for following First Ladies as they navigated the expansion of television in America?
Do you want to take that, Barbara?
Interesting.
Absolutely. Thank goodness for her sake,
Yeah.
we didn't have social media.
I know.
But
My goodness.
she's, in my view, is the model for raising, particularly raising young children in the White House. And so she maintained for herself and those two lovely children, John Jr. and Caroline, privacy. She did not want them photographed. Now, the president was different, so if she was away, he would get with Pierre Salinger and bring in photographers, and thank goodness, because we have some of the most beguiling.
Well, the photo of John Jr. under the desk would never have happened
Yes,
if
that's
she had stopped
true.
that. So
Iconic photo.
But she, and then she was contacted by Hillary Clinton, having a young daughter come into the White House in the Clinton years, and so they reached out to Mrs. Kennedy, and she said, as she said in the White House, Mrs. Kennedy did, that's the most important job of a first lady with young children. The Bush girls, the twins, were a little bit older and
They were in
starting into
college.
college.
it's also interesting just how many sets of daughters there have been at the White House. It's like one of these weird quirks of history.
Yes.
Like you have the Johnsons, you have like 2 daughters, and the Nixons, there were 2 daughters.
Margaret Truman.
Yeah, and marriages happening at the White House, which I think is again something where having back-to-back administrations where you have presidential families,
Obama
where there are
girls,
weddings
too.
in the White House, I think is something that's like one of these weird quirks of history where it kind of ramps up this press operation and there's just so much media interest that it actually kind of forces these women to like really like think about how they're running their press operation in a lot more depth.
Yes, but again with Mrs. Kennedy, and in her post-White House years, what I always say is she maintained her image, mentioned her image, she maintained her image and her legacy. She didn't write a memoir,
No.
she didn't go on
It's true.
Oprah, she maintained her privacy till the end. And I think that that's a model that I don't know if First Ladies, again, in the time of social media and 24/7 media can do so. But my hat is off to my pillbox hat is off. And with that, we must bring our conversation to a close. But we're
Thank you,
here if you'd
Barbara.
like
Thank
to
you,
speak.
Elizabeth.
And thank you not only to Alan but to Liz.
Yeah, thank you, Ellen.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Barbara.
Great.